My name is Adele Warren, and I was 26 when my sister announced her engagement. I remember the moment not because it changed anything for me, but because it reminded me of the role I had learned to play long before that day. In my family, I was the daughter who blended into the edges of every room, useful when needed, quiet when not, and always careful not to take up more space than someone thought I deserved. My sister, Lillian, carried the kind of brightness people liked to stand close to. Compliments gathered around her effortlessly. My presence, by comparison, created no ripple. I wasn't disliked, I was simply there. A placeholder in photographs, a dependable pair of hands during family gatherings, someone whose silence kept everything smooth. At that time, I didn't question any of it. I had grown up believing this arrangement was natural, that some people were meant to shine, while others kept the world steady from the shadows. My parents never said it directly, but their preferences were easy to read. Lillian's achievements were celebrated in tones that filled the whole house. Mine were acknowledged with polite nods, as if praise might encourage me to expect more attention than was reasonable. When Lillian announced her engagement to a man none of us had met yet, the excitement in the house felt almost ceremonial. My mother cried, my father opened a bottle he had been saving. I listened, smiled when appropriate, and moved around the kitchen in the quiet rhythm they had come to rely on. It didn't occur to me then that this silence of mine had become part of the family structure itself. I had been invisible for so long that no one questioned it, not even me. But small shifts were already beginning, subtle changes in tone I didn't yet recognize as the early signs of something harsher taking shape. Looking back, the years before Lillian's engagement blend into a quiet pattern I didn't have the language for at the time. Nothing dramatic, nothing sharp enough to call cruelty, just small, steady dismissals that slipped into the spaces where care should have been. They arrived as interruptions, as glances exchanged across dinner tables, as jokes that left no room for me to laugh along. And because they were subtle, I learned to absorb them without protest. Whenever I achieved something, a certification at work, a project completed, a brief acknowledgement followed, then a swift return to whatever mattered more that day. If I stumbled, though, the memory lasted longer. My shortcomings became stories retold at gatherings, softened with humor, yet cemented as part of who I was. Adele always overthinks things, or she means well, said with a smile that disguised a verdict. I remember offering ideas during family discussions and feeling the air change. Someone would talk over me, or shift the topic entirely, as though my voice lacked the weight to stay in the room. The pattern was so consistent that I began editing myself, trimming sentences before they fully formed, convinced brevity would make them easier to accept. Even small contributions, setting the table, organizing schedules, handling tasks no one else wanted, were treated as obligations rather than efforts. If I completed them, it was expected. If I forgot, it confirmed an assumption I couldn't quite name. Over time, these moments shaped the atmosphere around me, a quiet reminder that I was present but not essential. I didn't resent any of this. I simply adapted, believing the family moved around my quietness the way water shapes itself to stone. But as Lillian's engagement drew nearer, something shifted. The dismissals grew more open, spoken with less restraint, as if excitement granted permission to tighten the hierarchy we had long lived in. And without realizing it, I began to feel the first signs of being edged further out, from silence into something closer to erasure. As the engagement approached, the house shifted into a different rhythm, faster, louder, full of plans that seemed to multiply by the hour. My mother carried a notebook everywhere, pages filled with lists organized around Lillian's preferences. My father became a curator of opinions, weighing in on venues, musicians, and flower arrangements, as though each decision carried the weight of legacy. In every conversation, Lillian occupied the center with an ease that felt inevitable. I watched it all unfold from the periphery. Whenever I entered a room, discussions paused just long enough for someone to hand me a task. Pick up decorations, call vendors, confirm orders, deliver invitations. I moved from one errand to another, my presence acknowledged only through utility. It wasn't unkindness, it was simply the role they trusted me to fill. Comparisons surfaced more often, subtle at first, then gradually less disguised. My mother fretted over how radiant Lillian looked in every fitting, then offhandedly suggested I choose something simple to wear, something that wouldn't draw unnecessary attention. My father, usually reserved, remarked one evening that Lillian had always been more socially polished, a phrase delivered casually while he reviewed the guest list. I nodded, pretending the words didn't settle somewhere deep. Even Lillian, never intentionally cruel, began speaking with a softened edge around me. She asked for help with details she found tiring, then thanked me with a distracted smile, already absorbed in her next thought. I found myself shrinking further, smoothing my presence so nothing I did disrupted the excitement gathering around her. There was no single moment that marked the shift, only an accumulation. Each day carried a new expectation that I would manage something behind the scenes. When relatives called, I was the one who answered. When schedules clashed, I adjusted mine. If anything went wrong, I fixed it quietly before anyone noticed. And each time I did, the family grew more comfortable assuming I would continue. I didn't protest. I told myself this was normal, that engagement preparations were meant to be messy and all-consuming. But beneath that rationalization, a quiet pressure expanded, an awareness that my place hadn't just remained small, it had narrowed even further. By the time the engagement day arrived, I felt more like part of the event's machinery than a member of the family who would be seen or even considered. And I sensed, without fully understanding it, that the private imbalances of our home were about to become far more public. By the time I reached the venue, the noise of the celebration felt heavier than I expected. People moved in clusters, exchanging compliments about the decor and Lillian's ring. I carried a tray of small gifts my mother had asked me to deliver, though no one looked closely enough to see the effort behind it. I had hoped the crowd would blur everything, but anonymity can be unforgiving when those who know you decide you are safe to whisper about. I heard my name before I heard the words attached to it, drifting from a corner where two of my aunts stood discussing family updates. Their tone was casual, almost affectionate, as they recounted jobs I had applied for and didn't get, as though they were reading from an old script everyone had agreed upon. Another relative joined them and shifted the conversation to relationships, mentioning a man I had dated briefly years ago. They laughed softly at the memory, framing it as another example of my consistent misjudgment. I stood a few feet away, arranging gift boxes, pretending their voices were part of the general hum, but every sentence found its way to me with startling clarity. None of it was new, yet something about hearing it here, in a room filled with guests and celebration, made the words settle differently. Instead of brushing them off, I felt myself absorbing them, letting them confirm a story I had never agreed to but had quietly lived beneath. At one point, a cousin I rarely saw approached the group and asked who had managed all the preparation tasks. One of the aunts gestured vaguely toward me and said with a light laugh that I handled the small things because I didn't have much else going on. Someone else added that I had always been the dependable one, then corrected herself with a grin, actually the failure, but in a sweet way. Their laughter rose gently. What struck me most was the absence of hesitation. No one paused to reconsider the word. No one softened the moment with a counterpoint. The label settled in the air as if it had long been waiting for an audience. I didn't react. Instead, I kept arranging the boxes, aligning edges already straight, reminding myself to breathe without drawing attention. The room suddenly felt too large, filled with people who had known me my entire life, yet somehow never seen me. I realized I wasn't hurt by the word itself, but how naturally it fit into their understanding of me. I stepped back from the table, unsure whether I was moving away from them or from the version of myself they insisted on. Their voices faded, not because they stopped speaking, but because something inside me had begun to withdraw, folding inward, quietly questioning how much of their story I had unconsciously accepted as my own. I moved to the edge of the hall, choosing a spot where I could see everything without being seen. From there, the celebration looked almost weightless. People laughing, glasses catching the light, my sister glowing in the center as if the room had been built around her. I tried to focus on the music, on the soft hum of conversations, but my mind kept circling back to that single word I had pretended not to hear. Failure. It lingered with an ease that frightened me, as though it had always belonged to me and was only now being spoken out loud. I watched my family move between guests with practiced charm, and a thin, unsteady thought surfaced. What if they're right? Not just today, not just in this moment, but in all the moments before when they had gently, subtly shaped me into someone smaller than I once imagined I could be. I tried to dismiss the thought, but it pressed harder the longer I stayed in silence. I remembered every time I had stepped back to make room for someone else, convinced that avoiding conflict was the same as keeping peace. I remembered moments when I'd wanted to correct a story told about me or challenge a casual assumption, yet had swallowed my words because speaking up felt like overstepping. I wondered how many times I had let their interpretations become my truth, simply because it seemed easier than disproving them. Distance offered clarity, but it also exposed an ache I didn't know how to name. I realized I had spent years trying to appear unbothered, as if indifference could protect me from disappointment. In doing so, I had unintentionally confirmed for them that nothing I did mattered enough to be noticed. Their narrative had settled over me slowly, becoming familiar, becoming believable, and somewhere along the way, I began shaping myself to fit it. I watched Lillian laughing with a group of her friends, her happiness sincere and uncomplicated. There was no space in that brightness for my heaviness, and I didn't expect there to be. But I felt a quiet distance forming, not from her, but from the version of myself that had always stood behind her without question. The thought unsettled me. If I wasn't who they believed I was, then who had I allowed myself to become? The longer I stood there, the more the room blurred at the edges. Voices layered on top of each other until they felt like echoes underwater. I didn't cry. I simply folded inward, trying to understand how a single moment of public dismissal could unravel years of carefully maintained composure. I wondered if invisibility had been my choice or merely the result of becoming what was easiest for everyone else. I didn't notice him approach at first. It was the stillness beside me, the quiet, intentional presence that finally pulled me from my thoughts. When I looked up, the groom was already watching me, not with concern, but with a kind of patient curiosity that made it impossible to retreat further. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood beside me, hands loosely in his pockets, as if sharing silence were the most natural thing two strangers could do in a crowded room. When he finally turned slightly toward me, his expression held none of the polite detachment I expected. It was quieter than that, attentive in a way that made evasion feel unnecessary. "I haven't seen you sit down once tonight," he said, his tone light but observant. "Are you always this busy in the background?" The question disarmed me. Most people commented on what I hadn't done, never what I had been doing. I answered cautiously, offering half-formed explanations about tasks, responsibilities, and habits formed over years of stepping into gaps no one else noticed. He listened without interrupting, his attention steady, almost deliberate. After a pause, he asked about my work. Not what position I held or how much I earned, but what parts of it interested me. The simplicity of the question unsettled me. I told him about the projects I managed, the challenges I enjoyed, the small victories that rarely reached my family's awareness. He nodded as if these details mattered, as if they added up to something worth hearing. He didn't react to the noise around us, though I knew he had overheard the earlier comments. His stillness felt intentional, as if he were gathering more from what wasn't being said. When I hesitated mid-sentence, out of habit more than uncertainty, he waited instead of filling the space. That patience revealed more than any compliment could. A few minutes later, someone called his name from across the room. He excused himself, but before leaving, he said quietly, "You know none of what they said matches what you just told me." Then he walked away, leaving the words behind like a soft disruption. I thought that was the end of it. But when he reached the center of the room, where Lillian stood with guests gathered around, he paused. The group near the table made another joke at my expense. Light, familiar, confident that the groom was too far to hear. He turned his head, assessing them with a calmness that drew attention without effort. Then he raised his hand slightly and pointed toward me. "You're talking about her?" he asked, his voice carrying just enough to quiet the immediate circle. "The one who manages multi-level projects with a precision most companies struggle to find?" The room fell still, the laughter cooling instantly. My aunts exchanged uneasy glances, unsure how he knew anything about me at all. He continued, unruffled, "You call her a failure. I spent 10 minutes with her and learned more competence than what I've heard in the last half hour." His tone wasn't sharp, it was measured, as if he were stating a fact that needed no defense. No one responded, not because they agreed, but because the ease with which he dismantled their assumption left no space for denial. He didn't look at me afterward, didn't offer a reassuring smile or invite gratitude. He simply returned to Lillian's side, carrying on with the conversation as though nothing significant had happened. But something had. The narrative that had shaped my place in the family shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. And I realized, with a clarity I hadn't felt in years, that the story they had written for me was not the only version people could see. I didn't move when the room fell quiet. I simply remained where I was, hands loosely clasped, as if I had become part of the wall I'd been leaning against. The silence wasn't heavy or triumphant, it was simply there, stretching across the space like an unexpected truth everyone had to navigate around. I didn't look at anyone, not because I was avoiding their eyes, but because I no longer felt compelled to manage their reactions. For the first time, my quiet didn't read as uncertainty, it read as presence. My relatives shifted restlessly, offering thin smiles that didn't reach their eyes. A few tried to return to their earlier conversations, but their words came out strained, their laughter clipped. The easy confidence with which they had dissected my life minutes earlier evaporated. I could feel them glancing in my direction, waiting for some sign, hurt, gratitude, embarrassment, anything that would help them decide how to adjust themselves. I gave them nothing. My silence became a mirror they hadn't expected to face. Lillian noticed the shift almost immediately. She tried to pull the focus back toward herself, commenting on her dress, inviting compliments, gently nudging the room into familiar patterns where she shined brightest. But the energy had changed. People responded out of politeness, not excitement, their attention flickering toward me even when I stood perfectly still. She laughed a little louder than usual, spoke a little faster, as if volume alone could erase the interruption to her spotlight. It didn't work. No one dared address what the groom had said, yet everyone felt its weight. His words hadn't defended me, they had revealed them, exposed the ease with which they had diminished me without ever questioning why. And because he spoke without emotion, accusation, or alliance, the truth he delivered felt indisputable. I remained quiet, not out of shot, but out of a calm I didn't fully understand. There was nothing to correct, nothing to justify. My stillness made their discomfort sharper because they couldn't attribute it to anything I had done. They had been witnessed. That alone was enough to unsettle them. A few relatives approached me under the guise of small talk, their voices too sweet, their compliments suddenly elaborate. I nodded politely, offering no more than necessary. Their attempts felt like repairs to a structure they realized had been unstable for years. But I didn't participate in the reconstruction. I simply let the moment stand as it was. The groom never looked over at me again. He didn't need to. His intervention wasn't a gesture meant for me, it was a quiet correction to a dynamic he had seen clearly in a matter of minutes. And in its wake, something subtle but irreversible settled into place. The hierarchy I had lived beneath had cracked, not loudly, but cleanly, and while no one spoke about it, the fracture was visible in every careful word, every hesitant glance. I felt the impact before I understood it. Something in the room had shifted permanently, and the consequences of that shift were only just beginning to unfold. The days after the engagement passed strangely, as though the air in the house had been rearranged. No one mentioned the groom's words, yet every interaction carried the weight of what had been exposed. My mother began knocking on my door before entering, her voice unusually gentle when she asked if I needed anything. My father lingered longer at the breakfast table, offering comments about my work that felt rehearsed, as if he were trying to prove something neither of us believed. Their politeness was careful, almost ceremonial. It wasn't affection, it was a quiet scramble to rewrite the version of me they had allowed to solidify over years. They asked questions they had never asked before: what projects I was handling, whether I liked my apartment, if I planned to pursue further certification. The attention felt borrowed, as though they were borrowing someone else's idea of how a family should sound. I answered honestly, but without embellishment. I didn't punish them with silence, nor reward them with enthusiasm. I simply offered the bare truth and let the discomfort settle wherever it wished. In their attempts to appear supportive, I recognized a pattern. They weren't seeing me differently, they were reacting to being seen themselves. What changed wasn't their behavior, but my place within it. Without announcing anything, I stopped stepping into the roles that had once defined me. When errands needed doing, I waited for someone else to volunteer. When schedules clashed, I no longer rearranged mine to accommodate. I let them experience the small inconveniences I had absorbed for years, not out of spite, but out of a quiet decision to no longer disappear into usefulness. The shift wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, steady, woven into everyday choices. I spent more evenings alone, working on things that nourished me, rather than fulfilling obligations assigned without acknowledgement. I returned calls when I had the capacity. I visited when I genuinely wanted to. The thread of responsibility that had tethered me to their expectations loosened naturally. They noticed, but no one confronted it. Instead, they filled the silence with new courtesy, as though politeness could patch what had fractured. Yet the more they reached toward me, the more I felt the distance, not cold or bitter, just honest. I no longer needed to shrink to keep the peace, and without that anchor, the old dynamics lost their shape. I wasn't rising above anything, I was stepping out of something that never fit. And in that quiet shift, a deeper transformation began, one that had less to do with them and more to do with finally seeing myself without their narrative pressed against my skin. In the weeks that followed, I kept returning to one simple truth. That night hadn't healed anything. It hadn't rewritten the past or erased the patterns that had shaped me, but it had pulled something into focus, something I had avoided acknowledging for years. The way my family treated me wasn't a reflection of who I was, it was a reflection of what they had grown accustomed to, and I had allowed it, not out of weakness, but out of a long-practiced belief that harmony required my disappearance. Once I understood that, rebuilding didn't feel like a declaration, it felt like a quiet, deliberate untangling. I wasn't triumphant, I wasn't transformed, I was simply steadier, more grounded in the understanding that stepping out of the role they had written for me didn't require confrontation, it required consistency. And with each small shift, the distance between who I had been and who I was becoming grew clearer, guiding me gently toward an ending I hadn't yet reached but could finally imagine. Now, looking back from a distance I once couldn't imagine, I understand that the night of my sister's engagement didn't mark a turning point because someone defended me. It marked a turning point because, for the first time, I saw how small I had allowed myself to become. The groom, Elias, was never more than a brief intersection in my life. We didn't become friends, and we never shared a conversation beyond that evening. He wasn't meant to stay. He simply stood in a moment where everyone else stepped aside, and his clarity showed me a version of myself I had forgotten existed. My family still slips into old patterns occasionally. Habits formed over years don't unravel quickly, and I no longer expect them to. What has changed is the weight those patterns carry. Their opinions no longer define the edges of my identity, and their approval isn't a currency I work for. I engage with them from a place that feels steady, choosing what I offer instead of anticipating what they need. Distance isn't punishment, it's alignment. There are days when I remember the girl arranging gift boxes at the edge of a crowded room, hearing herself reduced to a punchline, spoken lightly enough to pass as affection. I don't resent her, I don't pity her, I simply understand her now. She thought survival meant being agreeable, unobtrusive, endlessly accommodating. She didn't realize that quiet can become a cage when it's used to make others comfortable. I still move quietly through the world, but the quiet is different. It's deliberate, not defensive. It gives me room to decide where I stand, instead of waiting to be placed. And every so often, when I catch myself shrinking out of habit, I remember that moment Elias pointing toward me, not to rescue me, but to acknowledge what was already mine. I don't need his voice anymore. I don't need anyone to translate my worth back to me. That night didn't make me braver, but it made me aware. And awareness, I've learned, is its own kind of freedom. I walk through my life now with a steadiness that doesn't ask for permission. Not louder, not harder, just whole. Finally, it is the certainty I once searched for in others, and eventually learned to find within.